The American Lyceum rebuilds the institution of debate as a cornerstone of our democracy. Once vital and informative, presidential debates have devolved into disrespectful, open mic,
because you'd be in jail,
cage matches.
For the Republic to survive, we the people must learn to talk to one another again. The Lyceum format is focused on finding solutions, not a binary resolution. 3 participants have 3 minutes to propose 3 ideas aimed at one problem. The American Lyceum. Let us rebuild the foundation of civil society. It's presidential primary debate season again, as the primary season kicks off for an election that is more than a year away. The question for our debate today at the American Lyceum is, how can the presidential primary debates get any worse? Actually, the question is, how can presidential debates be improved? And we've actually got 3 experts, one who's moderated a presidential debate, one who's written the best-selling book on the debate, and one who helped the president win the White House. So, first of all, is Mary Katharine Ham. Mary Katharine is a longtime CNN contributor, been on Fox News multiple times, co-author of a book called End of Discussion. Mary Katharine did moderate a presidential debate with Donald Trump and asked him some hardball questions for which she got social media ire. We also have Alan Schroeder. Alan wrote a book called Presidential Debates, 40 Years of High-Risk TV, updated it with a second edition, 50 years, and then he's got a third edition now about presidential debates you can find on Amazon. It's used in political science classrooms around the country, and he's referred to often to ask about the upcoming debate season. We have him today to give us advice, 3 ways to improve the process. And then finally, David Urban. David's a West Point graduate. You've probably seen him on CNN as a conservative voice. He was an advisor in the 2016 primary and presidential campaign that helped Donald Trump win the White House by going after swing states like David's home state of Pennsylvania. After his stint in the Army as an artillery officer in the famed 101st Airborne, he moved to Washington, D.C., and is a famed power broker between centrist liberals and conservatives doing right by his state of Pennsylvania. So the 3 of them bring a unique perspective, and they're going to help us figure out how we can fix this broken thing that's become a bit of an open mic cage match. That's the way I describe presidential debates, and make it into something better, if not for this cycle, then going forward. We're going to start today's debate with a comment, 3 minutes opening statement by Alan Schroeder.
I like to think of presidential debates as job interviews that belong not to the candidates, not to the media, not to the political parties, but to the voters. And with that in mind, I have a few thoughts of how to improve, particularly the presidential primary debates, and ways to just make them more relevant to the voters and to really help effectuate this idea of a job interview. First, I would say that primary debates are a great place to experiment with formats. That formats do not need to be rigid. Granted, it's tough with a lot of people on the stage, but I would love to see, for instance, a single theme debate, a debate on a topic such as immigration or, gun violence, the environment, take your pick, or perhaps a debate that is a case study, or a debate in which policy experts are the ones asking the questions. This was actually tried in the 2012 cycle in a debate in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute. Very successful, very interesting, but it's the only time it's ever been done. My second point has to do with the live audiences. I think having live audiences in place for presidential primary debates tends to encourage the candidates to play to the crowd, to pander. to try to create moments in which they gain the approval of the audience that's right there in front of them, when in reality we ought to be thinking about the millions of people watching at home. So again, if the point of debates is to serve the electorate, then let's make it the best possible venue for the wide electorate, not just the people in the hall. When Kennedy and Nixon met in 1960 for their series of 4 televised debates, those all took place in TV studios. Absolutely no audience in attendance. And, we don't think about that, but I think that really had an effect on the quality of those debates. And then finally, I would say that I would like to see primary debates return to local sponsorship. Around the late 90s, early 2000s, the political parties, the national political parties, and the cable news networks got in the business of taking over the primary debates, limiting the number, imposing a lot of conditions for participation. And I think we've lost something. It used to be that the local media, the local colleges, the local civic organizations in the various states were the debate sponsors. And we're now at a point where that is no longer the case, to the detriment of the debates. So I look forward to discussing all this as we go along.
That was fantastic. We're going to shift now to a question and answer session where Mary Katharine and David will both be able to ask one question and give you a chance to answer. So David, why don't we start with you?
Alan, I hear your point about the live audience versus studio audience. No audience at all, and just in a kind of a cold studio. But I would just submit that a live audience brings something else to the debate. It brings a certain level of energy. It brings a certain level. The candidates, believe it or not, I think are a little more nervous. They're a little more edgy. They're not as relaxed as if they're going into a cold, dark studio. So do you think that, and I understand your point about kind of playing and pandering to the crowd, but do you think by not having that audience participate and be there, that'll diminish it somehow? I know you think it might do it, but do you think that might be a valid point, that there's a certain loss of energy, and it's like going into a sporting venue and playing in front of nobody, at a basketball game versus playing it in Rupp Arena in front of thousands of fans. The game's a little different. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I totally get your point. I think, in general, I wish we could make our politics more interactive, and by having an audience there, it shows that people are interested and they care enough to be there. I just think the trade-off for that is not worth it, especially now that the cable news networks seem to have taken over the presidential primary debate process. They want conflict. They want all of this booing and cheering and yelling, and it makes a better show for them, but not necessarily for the voters.
Alan, I have to ask a quick question. Is there a debate where you noticed the live audience was particularly problematic?
Well, there's a famous example from a general election primary debate, the famous Benson-Quayle debate of 1988. The Democrats in the audience actually had cheerleaders on each row. They had packed their side of the house, and so whenever Benson said something, they'd get the crowd going, and whenever Quayle said something, they'd get the boos going. And after that, the debate commission actually mixed things up to where the Democrats couldn't all sit together, the Republicans couldn't all sit together. The crowds had to be interspersed to avoid that sort of thing. But you really do notice it more in the primary debates.
Historically, Tim, also, the campaigns have kind of rounded up folks, put them on a bus, and sent their people. So, you'd have the DeSantis people show up, and you'd have the Cruz people show up, and if you're a good campaign, you'd have your surrogates kind of out in the audience cheering at the appropriate time and sneering at the appropriate time. So it, if you can game it, it does have a bigger impact.
Was there anything, like there were the Bernie bros, were there Romney rowdies? Was that ever a thing? Or
I don't think so. I don't remember any Romney rowdies.
Right.
I think the Romney rowdies didn't wear ties.
Okay, that's right. So All right, I'm going to be more serious as a moderator. Mary Catherine, what's your hardball question for Alan here?
Yes, when it comes to local sponsorship, there's been a lot of years during which these very powerful entities, cable news nets, the parties themselves, and these candidates are deeply invested in running these debates. They're deeply invested in the rules, very understandably. There's a lot of history of knowing that if you flop here, it's very bad news for you. Tell me a little bit about those local sponsorships, what those would look like, and how you prevent smaller organizations that haven't been doing this as long from being big-footed by the big guys who want to impose their rules.
Very tough to avoid being big-footed. But, you don't have to go back too far in history to remember when the Des Moines Register, for instance, or the Manchester Union Leader were the ones doing the debates, or St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire. And they would be carried on C-SPAN, so the junkies out there always got an opportunity to see them. But what you didn't have were these big 2-hour spectacles with commercial breaks, which, by the way, I think is a bad thing. I don't think debates should be about advertising. I don't think they should be about generating ratings particularly. But I just think it sort of keeps the focus on the individual states where the primaries are taking place. It could be more responsive to local issues, which the voters in those states would be interested in pursuing. And mainly I think it keeps it a little more down home, a little less national, and more responsive to the way we elect candidates during the primaries, which is state by state.
Hey guys, pleasure to be here with you to discuss the problem of improving America's presidential debates, particularly in the primaries, with the guy who wrote the book on it, literally, and the guy who was friends with the president who was doing it. So I have moderated one primary debate, and so I have a little bit of experience myself. I would submit that this might have been broken for quite a while. There's a Nixon quote post-1960 that says, "I recognized the basic mistake I had made. I had concentrated too much on substance and not enough on appearance." So with that in mind, I think we should try to create substance while not scaring off the audience, because I do want them to be engaged as much as possible. So a couple ideas. Number one, a segment within a debate that is 8 to 10 minutes in which the candidates can cross-examine each other. Despite being a moderator, I think they can take up too much space. It can be too much about them. And these candidates are public speakers who are capable of talking to each other and keeping it civil. And yes, sometimes testy and challenging each other. But a section that is informed, they're informed beforehand about a topic, they differ on the topic, and they can just go at it a little bit, I think would be helpful. The abortion segment of the most recent primary debate for Republicans, I think, is an example of this, where it got pretty heady and it got pretty interesting. Number two, just fewer topics per debate. If you want a domestic policy debate, great. Let's make it an economics debate, because there are so many avenues there. You can talk about personal finances. You can talk about the market. You can talk about government spending. And I think when we squeeze too many things in, we get in a bad place where you're diving really shallow on these issues. And last, a little bit of format change idea here that's a little bigger, which is to give each candidate, depending on how many you have, a chess clock or sort of a countdown clock, 30 minutes, whatever it is, to say, hey, this is your allotted time, use it as you see fit, and you have a little chess clock timer in front of you that you can hit to alert when you want to talk and when you don't. That way you know what their priority is. It adds drama for the audience because they can see that clock running down. And I think that is one of the ways you could preserve some of this audience interest while also getting more substance. And aside from making it Family Feud, which would be fun, but maybe not so informative, those are my ideas.
Mary Catherine, I like this idea of the cross-examination, but I have a feeling, based on the historical record here, that the candidates themselves and their handlers would be very reluctant to allow a debate that really, let them go at each other. How can we persuade candidates that they don't need to be afraid of innovations like a cross-examination?
Well, one of the things I think you can appeal to that they have plenty of is their vanity. these are smart people. These are people who want to be in the public eye. They're people who want to dust it up. And I know that they're often their handlers are more careful than they are. And yes, there is risk here. But one of the things I think that the public can demand, or that a debate commission or these local organizations can demand, is that we do work out of the box a little bit. You can also, I think, could provide for these campaigns examples like the last primary Republican debate, where the topic was abortion, and there was a lot of back and forth about balance between the moral question and people's liberties. There was questions about federalism, and it was informative, and everyone was sort of on their game and doing well because they can talk about policy, and we should ask them to do so.
Yeah. So MK, I really, appreciate the idea about the clock, right? Anyone who's watched a congressional hearing, is well aware that both the members as well as the respondents have a timer that sits in front of them that has a red, yellow, and green like light, and it goes in, kind of a countdown from 5 minutes on, and you'll frequently see people, kind of hurrying their responses to get into the 5 minute, time. Unfortunately, as we've seen in many debates, and this most recent debate on Fox News, that the time was up. The buzzer, they had this annoying buzzer that kept buzzing. It sounded ridiculous, and Brett Baer, they just couldn't get control of the candidates because they didn't want to listen, right? So you have to have people who are willing to be compliant, right? Either that or shut off the mic. And so I'm just wondering, what you thought about that, is because there's people. My argument was, well, just shut their mics off, right, at whatever time, and then they can't speak. But then there's blowback on that. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how do you make people with, as you earlier alluded to, with big egos and strong personalities, right, play by the rules?
Well, the idea with this, and I'm cribbing a bit, by the way, from a study and a report from the Annenberg Public Policy Center that looked into some, in 2015, that looked into some reforms, is that the candidates would be in more control. So they would be able to hit their clock to take the floor. And then when they hit it off, you could perhaps have a mic stop on that. I think this is something that could work with fewer candidates. I don't think you want 8 of them going at it in this way, but it takes some of the focus off the moderator because they are in control of the timing. And what I like about it too is they get to decide what's important to them and what they want to talk about, which I think is something that could appeal to that interest in themselves, which they often have. But I think you could get some real substantive back and forth because a candidate is deciding, well, this is something I'm passionate about and I really want to get in there, instead of waiting my turn and making the moderator the focus once again.
Primary debates with multiple candidates are very unwieldy by nature, right? As people struggle for relevancy, right? They struggle to be noticed on the stage. And so I just have kind of 3 basic high-level ideas. One would be fewer moderators, not necessarily fewer candidates, fewer moderators, because the give and take between the moderators ends up chewing up a lot of time, and it's frequently, it's one moderator is worried about stepping on the other moderator, and no one knows. It seems they don't know when to cut the candidate off or not cut the candidate off, and so I think having a single moderator makes it a little bit easier. And I've got, and having spoken to some of the folks who've moderated debates, I think they believe it's easier with one moderator as well. The second point would be, I'd like to see a little bit different formatting and substance to the debates. People get learn a little bit about more of the candidates, and so maybe it's an attempt to that, to have pre-filled out questionnaires on the big topics, on what do you think about Ukraine or involvement in NATO or abortion, and you have that kind of cut down, uploaded to the website or social media, right, and released immediately prior to the debate, so that none of the candidates know in advance, but they, the people at home can kind of click on and look. And then finally, I'd like to see in these debates, I'd like to see a little bit more about the people that are actually running for office, right, versus then some pie in the sky policy where you have Vivek Ramaswamy saying, well, I'm going to close every federal agency tomorrow, right? We know those things aren't going to happen, but I'd like to hear from Vivek, like, who is the most impactful person in your life and why, right? Or what's the most important book you've read and why? Talk about some ideas behind these people, because anybody can get up there and give like a quick gimmicky soundbite that really gets a round of applause and it's pre-canned and pre-tested. But when people have to be, have to be real, right? You peel back the onion to see who these people really are. I think that's, Alan talked about it earlier. It's important for people at home to really learn about these candidates, and you don't really get that anyplace. You don't really get the people's bio and who they are as an individual unless you ask those really probing questions. And I'd like to see more of that. I thought Fox did a great job asking about this, real rich men north of Richmond question, which I think each candidate really bumbled in this last debate. They didn't really talk about it and talk about why it might have been important to real people, because that wasn't a part of the script. No one had prepared them to answer that question, right? And so I'd really like to hear more about that from the candidates and it's really who they are.
All right, David, I will ask a moderator-centric question since I was one. And here it is. I like the idea of hearing more about these guys' bios. How do you pitch to a moderator? Like, moderators are always like, well, I want to ask something really substantial and a little tough, and they feel like the policy-based ones and a little bit of gotcha might be the way to do that. Bio questions seem softball-y, right, on their face or at first glance. How do you convince them that should be more a part of the format?
I think, it's kind of a little bit chicken and an egg, right, MK? I think you're going to have to do it once or twice to really have people in. Everybody, is going to say that, certain variation on, the abortion question was very interesting and how it was answered, right? But everyone was kind of predictable in where they were going to be. Same on Ukraine, same on NATO, no more like lengthy foreign wars. But like, tell me the book that you read that was most impactful in your life and why, right? I mean, heck, that's kind of a tougher question to answer, and it can't be the Bible, right? That maybe it can't be the Bible, right? So you take that, because every Republican is going to say, well, it's Leviticus, the Bible, or some canned answer. And I'd say specifically, tell me a book you read that's impactful or why, or an incident in your life that was, you can ask some really probing questions that really get to who a person is, right? On empathy, on things, on leadership. Who's the best leader you've ever witnessed and why? What was the biggest failure of leadership you've seen and why? And I think that gets to it. And I think, unfortunately, it's a little chicken and egg. You got to do it once or twice before you're going to convince anybody. But I think you end up with more of those, meaningful moments in these debates than you get with, 8 people answering, that they think the 10th Amendment's the most important thing in the world.
I like what you say about the single moderator. I think one of the problems with having cable news in charge of debates is they want to show off their talent. They're paying these people a lot of money. They got to get their money's worth. So you end up sometimes with almost as many moderators as you do, which has a tradition of presidential debaters, which is ridiculous. But I'm curious what you think about in France, for instance, where it's going back almost as long as ours. They do have 2 moderators, but the moderators say almost nothing. They tee up a topic and then shut up and enforce time as needed. So I guess my question to you is, do we need moderators at all, except for the purposes of keeping time?
Yeah, Alan, I think your point is well taken, right? In terms of, the networks, cable and otherwise, all want to focus on their talent, showcase their talent. And so, you kind of have one, sideline analyst, a color analyst, a person who's a play-by-play person, right? It gets to be a little bit ridiculous. It gets to be more about those folks than it is the candidates. And so I would agree with you. I think that the moderator's role is to kind of ask, call balls and strikes, ask questions, and kind of get out of the way and let these folks answer. And so, and I think, again, a single moderator it is a little bit better doing that. Is a little bit better at doing that than multiple moderators, because you just have that. You have crosstalk a lot, and it just becomes a little bit cumbersome if you have more than one person, perhaps just even posing those questions.
Presidential debates are one of the few steps along the way of a presidential campaign that belong to the people. And so I think we need to really think about how to make these debates the most challenging to the candidates that they can be and the most revealing of the candidates to help inform voters as they make their decisions here. So I think we've been sort of locked into some pretty rigid formats over the years. We've had debates in America now for more than 60 years, and the political class has figured out how to game that. So anything that we can do to kind of throw some curveballs to keep the candidates from lapsing into their talking points and their stump speeches, I think is worth an effort. My dream format, by the way, which has never been done, is a case study. They do this in business schools. I was briefly a foreign service officer. We trained that way in the State Department. It's just a really interesting way to see how people's minds work. And I think that should be the objective. I'm very concerned about this idea of live audiences during the debates that color the response and maybe make it seem like something's happening on that stage that really isn't. And so I would go back to the future on this, back to 1960, get the candidates into a studio, put the audience somewhere else, and really focus on the people at home. And then I think it's just a real problem to make these things money makers for the cable news networks, where they sell advertising and expect huge ratings and showcase their talent. The needs and the objectives of the cable news networks are not the same as those of the voters. And by the same token, the political parties. I think it's ridiculous that a political party would ask candidates to sign a loyalty pledge or say that they're going to take delegates away if you do a debate other than one of our officially sanctioned ones. Seems to me that the political parties should step out of the way and let this go back to the states and, a little more federalism, if you will, in the whole presidential primary process.
First of all, God would like a word with David for excluding the Bible from the choices, and I would like a word with both of my opponents here, my worthy opponents here, for excluding moderators almost entirely. But I like a lot of these ideas. What I will say about my ideas is I think we do need a shakeup here. And I think you start a little bit small with some reforms, like a simple one segment cross-examination, and you tell these guys, you can handle this. You talk about these policies. You are smart people, even when they're sometimes not. And you tell them that and you let them go for it, because this is shorter than a TV segment, right? Maybe 5 minutes, maybe a longish TV segment. They can handle that. They've been trained for this. Make a debate that's a little more substantive because it has fewer topics in it. These are things we can ease them into before taking on something a little larger, right? But when you're talking about something like a big format change with the chess clock and saying you have a countdown clock on your talking, I think they're motivated to govern themselves in that moment. I'd like to see how leaders can govern themselves. And the thing about serving the American people and wanting to be the leader of the free world is that part of the job is being capable of that. Part of the job is looking for new formats, looking for new solutions, and dare I say it, being bold every now and then. And so I think in talking people into these ideas, that's what you go with. And you say, you're asking to be a leader. How about you start leading for us?
Tim, thanks for hosting us and putting this together. I think it's important to have these kind of debates and discussions about how we can improve, presidential debates in the entire process. As I've kind of articulated earlier, maybe not so artfully, my concern about debates is that the candidates really, they all kind of give kind of pan answers on these broad subjects, whether it's abortion, whether it's, foreign wars, membership in NATO, and on and on and on. But people really don't get to know, who the candidates are and really get to know them a little bit better. And I think that's a very important part of the presidential debates. For example, just to point to this current election, Ron DeSantis is an incredibly capable governor, a very capable, administrator, and ran the state of Florida and runs the state of Florida very effectively. But on the campaign trail, he's never kind of caught fire. People don't really get to know him, and is the more they've got to know Ron DeSantis, they've his numbers have plummeted, and they've like him less and less according to the polls, right? And I think that's a function that debates can provide if done correctly, right? If you have a single moderator, if you have some questionnaires done in advance, you take some of the heavy, weighty stuff off, and you really get to the nub of who people are. I think it would be really important because, whether, if people in Iowa get this all the time, you get this funny quote, and you're like, well, who do you like? Do you like, Donald Trump? And people, Iowa voters will say, oh, geez, I don't know. I've only met him 4 or 5 times. I'll let you know in a little bit. And so I think debates can serve the purpose of allowing the rest of America to get the experiences that people in Iowa and New Hampshire get. Many they get to really know the candidates, and they get that by having them in their living rooms and in their dining rooms and getting to know them as persons, not necessarily just as a policy. So I think by perhaps taking some of the big, heavy, weighty debate stuff out of, do you support, more funding for Ukraine? We'll put that on an answer, put on the website, post in social media. Everyone can read it. But tell us about who you are as a person, and we want to know that. What do you do with your kids on the weekends? Those kind of things that everybody in America deals with, I think, are going to be much more important and help persuade people, inform people who these candidates really are moving forward. So thanks.
Thanks for watching. There are 3 ways you can help us strengthen civil society. 1, like this video. 2, share the link. And 3, subscribe to the Lyceum Debates YouTube channel. Now that you've heard the debate, it's time to cast your vote for what you think were the best ideas. Here's how it works. Go to the AmericanLyceum.org debates page to cast your vote. Or you can go directly to the voting page by clicking the link in the description below. This debate was made possible thanks to the J.P. Conte Family Foundation. If you support our effort to rebuild American civil society, please make a donation to the Lyceum right now. Your donation will be tax deductible and is deeply needed. Go to theamericanlyceum.org. Thanks again to all the Lyceum donors who are rebuilding American civil society.